Home stretch.
In Module 3, we're going to discuss conflicts of interest and dual relationships with clients. We're going to discuss boundaries and boundary issues, transference and countertransference, and secondary trauma issues. And I feel it's important anytime I do this workshop to talk about secondary trauma, even though you don't typically see it in an ethics training, because I think we can't be the best practitioners that we could possibly be without taking good care of ourselves. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that. But let's start with potential conflicts or dual relationship issues. Well, socializing with clients is a very obvious issue that's a boundary violation or a relationship issue. Providing services to your relatives or to friends would be another instance of a boundary violation or a dual relationship. Becoming emotionally or sexually involved with a client or former client, and we'll spend some time talking about that today and what the rules are with regard to those relationships. Combining the roles of supervisor and therapist, believe it or not, is another dual relationship issue that we often run into in this field, so we'll address that a little bit. Having a business relationship with a client, loaning money to clients, accepting gifts from clients, which I know some people do, but we are going to talk about the problems inherent in accepting gifts from clients, and excessive therapist self-disclosure. That is also a big issue in this field, and we will address it. Now, in our NASW Code of Ethics, Standard 1.06 says that social workers should be alert to and avoid conflicts of interest that interfere with the exercise of professional discretion and impartial judgment. Social workers should inform clients when a real or potential conflict of interest arises and take reasonable steps to resolve the issue in a manner that makes the client interest primary and protects the client's interest to the greatest extent possible. So we have a duty not to engage in wrong or dual relationships with clients. We should not take unfair advantage of the relationship with clients or exploit clients for the purposes of personal, religious, political, or business gain or interests. We can't engage in dual or multiple relationship with the clients or former clients where there's a risk of exploitation or potential harm to the client, including sexual relationships. So in Standard 1.09 in specific, NASW says that social workers should under no circumstances engage in sexual activities or sexual contact with current clients. But social workers also should not engage in sexual activities or sexual contact with clients' relatives or other individuals with whom the client maintains a close personal relationship. And we shouldn't become sexually involved with former clients either. Now, Ohio law, and this is in the Ohio Administrative Code 4757, says that we need to avoid multiple relationships and conflicts of interest with any clients, consumers of services, ex-clients, family members of clients, or ex-clients which are not in the best interest of the client. But in Ohio, you can engage in a sexual intimacy with a former client after 5 years of termination of your therapeutic relationship. So NASW says once a client, always a client, and that you should never have sexual involvement with a former client, and I tend to agree that that is the best policy, but Ohio law, believe it or not, does allow it after 5 years from termination. Now, the tricky part about this is you do have to be able to prove that your relationship sexually did not harm the client in any way, and I don't know how you would do that, because once a client sees you as a counselor, I don't see how they can see you in a healthy way in any other role. So I tend to agree with NASW, once a client, always a client. If for some reason there is a multiple relationship and it's not sexual, sexual relationships would be an exception, but in Ohio, if there is a multiple relationship that's recognized, you must discuss that issue with the client. You can continue with the relationship only if both parties are in agreement. You have to document that conflict of interest, and you have to prove why it's in the best interest of the client and not harmful. So again, with any kind of dual relationship, it's best if you do not engage in a dual relationship. I've often joked that a situation where you might have to would be if you're the only practitioner in this small village in Alaska and everyone in the village seems to be related to you. There's not a whole lot you could do to avoid a dual relationship. So you would have to document that and prove how it's in the best interest of the client. But very rarely are you going to run into a situation where that's really the case. Now, interesting note. What are the symptoms reported by clients that had sexual contact with their therapists? Well, some of the symptoms they reported include denial, guilt, shame, isolation, anger, depression, impaired ability to trust, loss of self-esteem, difficulty expressing anger, emotional lability, psychosomatic disorders, sexual confusion, and increased risk of suicide. Now, if you really think about that list that I just gave you, that list also corresponds with another list that we often see, and it's a list of symptoms that sexual abuse victims tend to exhibit. Why is that? Because if you're having sex with clients, it really is sexual abuse, and they're going to experience the same feelings as folks who are sexually abused. Now, when I teach this class at Ohio State University, my students will say to me, why are we spending so much time covering sexual relationships with clients? Why do we, we know it's wrong, why do we cover it so much? Well, first of all, because it does happen, and it has happened in this state, where therapists have become sexually involved with clients. But a second reason has to do with a study that was done by Berkman et al. In 2000. And basically, what that study found was that MSW students who agreed that sexual contact was acceptable, those numbers were higher than we would have liked to see. For example, 25% agreed that if the clinical relationship was more than 5 years ago, that it's okay to have sex with clients. They didn't see the harm in that. That's a quarter of the MSW students that were polled. Students felt that if your role was only to assist clients with concrete services like driving them to and from appointments, helping them sign up for food stamps, well, 15% of those MSW workers felt like it was okay to engage in a sexual relationship. And MSW students felt like it was okay to engage in a sexual relationship with a client if the clinical relationship was brief, lasting of only 2 sessions or less. 15% of them felt like it was okay to be sexually involved with a client. So it is important to cover these things. It's important to be aware of these things so that you don't make these mistakes and cause clients to feel those same levels of victimizations that other sexual abuse victims feel. It really does matter. Now, let's talk about boundary issues in general. Well, boundary issues occur when social workers face conflicts of interest in the form of those dual or multiple relationships, but it doesn't have to be sexual. We could also be talking about social relationships, religious relationships, or even business relationships. So let's run a scenario by you that, believe it or not, is a boundary violation. You have a cold, and you're having difficulty controlling your cough during your therapy group. You're coughing up a lung in the middle of your therapy group, and a client offers you a cough drop. Now, it's just a little cough drop, so it should be okay to take that cough drop, right? Well, actually, it's not a good idea, and I suggest to my clinicians and students that I work with that you not take anything from clients. For one thing, you don't know where that cough drop has been or what it may be doctored with, even though that's quite rare. But more importantly, cough drops even are getting expensive. Clients don't have a lot of money. In most cases, we have more money than they do, and it's important that we let them keep what belongs to them, and that we tell them that we don't want to take from you, and we certainly don't want to create a debt where we feel like we owe you something or you feel like we owe you something later on. We want to keep that therapeutic relationship on therapeutic grounds and not blur those boundaries by having you take care of me by handing me a cough drop. So believe it or not, that kind of thing matters. Okay, let's try another scenario. Your patient's family brings you food to thank you. I have a lot of clinicians tell me they're going to take the food. They're not going to want to offend the family. And I will tell you that while I understand that, it's a boundary violation. It sets up a debt. It means the family is now on some level taking care of you. They may not have the money to cook these types of things, but here they are doing this for you. And again, for safety reasons, you don't know what they may have put in the food that they're giving to thank you, even though that's quite rare. So you want to be very, very careful about that. I have clinicians that tell me, but I don't want to offend the family. And what you can tell them is, or what you can tell your client is, I am so touched that you did this for me. It means a lot to me. I cannot accept it. My agency policy or my board policy is that I cannot accept gifts, but I sure do appreciate what you did for me. And I hope you'll take these brownies back home and enjoy them, and that'll make me feel good if you do that. So that's the way I handle that situation. Now, a lot of people in my workshops will say, what about cultural issues? Sometimes in certain cultures, if you decline food, you're actually offending the family. And what I say in those situations is, while I understand that that can be difficult, I try as best I can to be gentle, and again suggest that I am very, very honored that they welcomed me into their home and that they offered this to me, but that a part of my agency culture is that I am not allowed to accept that gift, that food, that item. So as much as I appreciate it and recognize and respect that that's a part of their culture, my agency culture dictates that I can't do that. But I thank you very much for the offer. Most of the time that's acceptable. Now, what about the elderly client who knits you a sweater from her hospital bed? She has arthritis. She worked on your sweater all day. She wants to give you this sweater to thank you for everything you did for her. Are you really going to turn down this elderly client who knitted you this sweater all day long? And most of the time in my workshops, people say, nope, I'm going to take the sweater. But what I will tell you about that is, that may be all the money she had. That may be the biggest thing that she spent money on. She may be on a very limited income, and that sweater then is a big chunk of what she's got. So what you may suggest is, I am so touched by what you did for me, and I really appreciate it. But since agency policy says that I can't accept it, here's what would make me feel even better if this is okay with you. Would you mind if we donated that sweater to an organization where I know they will give it to someone who needs it more than me? That will actually make me happier. And then you're not actually accepting the sweater. You're not violating your agency policy. You're not blurring boundaries with her. And most of you will say something like, but it's a sweater. It's, you know, this is a woman in her hospital bed. What could it possibly hurt to accept this woman's sweater? Well, let me explain how important it is that you not accept the sweater. Anytime you accept something from a client, if you don't accept things from other clients, you are doing damage. And I know that most clinicians would never intend this and probably would not even be aware that they're causing damage. But the point is, if you accept something from one client, you must be prepared to accept from all clients. And that means you're going to have closets and closets full of things, and you might even be setting up an expectation among clients that, well, you have to give her something or you have to do something for her to thank her. And we don't want to put our clients in those kinds of binds. And we don't want to hurt their feelings and make them feel bad, because oftentimes they'll sit out in your waiting room and they'll compare notes. And if one got something from you or gave you something and another didn't, you're hurting feelings, you're creating damage without ever having known that you did that. So it's better if you can have a blanket policy and treat everyone similarly so that you don't hurt anyone's feelings and create damage. Let's try this scenario. Your patient has very low self-esteem, and as a result, they've been afraid to enter art shows or use their talents as an artist for failing, and they're a very, very, very talented artist. You assist this client with helping to the point where he gets his own art exhibition. Now, to thank you for him finally experiencing an art exhibition and getting his art out there and feeling good about himself, he wants to thank you by doing victim awareness posters for your office. That sounds like a great idea, right? Because it's going to help you, it's going to help the victims that come into your office. They're going to see these posters. It helps him because he's able to thank you, and it improves his self-esteem, and he's a great artist. Sounds like a great idea, right? But it's not. It's a dual relationship. You're now exploiting him for something that he's actually doing as a laborer. And you cannot set up that kind of relationship. I know it doesn't seem like you're exploiting him. He volunteered, but it is exploitation. He could probably earn money for doing those types of things. So you cannot set up that kind of a relationship. I know at times it's tempting, especially with clients that aren't working, to give them odd jobs. If we could employ them around the agency to trim the lawn or to care for the building, etc., or clean up the trash, it would be a great, great thing to do. And it would help them. The problem is it blurs boundaries. What if you can't say yes to the other 20 clients who also need jobs and need to do those things? Now you've created damage. So you need to think about those kinds of things and the impact. Okay, but what about the Girl Scout cookies? You have a little Girl Scout. It's the first group she's ever joined, and you helped her join. And she brings in her little cookie order form. And she wants you to buy some cookies from her. And you know you're not going to be exploiting her because the cookies cost a certain amount and that's what she's charging and that's what you'd pay. So it's okay, right, to buy the Girl Scout cookies from her? Well, I know it seems like it would be, and I know it seems like a great thing to do, but then you have to buy all of your girls' Girl Scout cookies. You have to buy the band candy when the kids bring around the band candy. If they have magazine offers, you have to buy their magazines to help their school, and now you have to do all these things for everybody. And again, you're going to go broke as a social worker trying to buy all of these things from all these kids. And why would you have to do that? Because you can't just do something for one. Your clients talk to each other. Oftentimes they'll talk to each other in your own waiting room. And if one says, she bought my Girl Scout cookies, she bought 2 boxes, and another one says, well, she didn't buy anything from me, now you've created damage. And you're not even aware of it. You're not even aware of that conversation. You've created damage. Now, I have had hospice workers say, but we are going to go and go to funerals and do things for families, and that would be fine. I understand that hospice can at times be a different situation and that you're going to do what you feel is right, but just remember then, if you run into people who had hospice workers and their hospice workers didn't come to the funeral and so forth, then you're still creating damage. So be sensitive and be mindful of that. Let's talk about another potential boundary issue, and this is a similar type of thing that you may notice in therapy settings that counselors and clinicians and social workers seem to be somewhat uncomfortable dealing with. So we're going to talk about this one. You're working with a male sex offender or any male client who's very promiscuous and has boundary issues. He asks for an individual session to work through a serious crisis, a legitimate crisis. He thanks you for seeing him at such short notice and tells you he loves you for doing it. Now, many counselors, because they're uncomfortable, would kind of ignore that issue and just not deal with the fact that he said that. However, he has issues around promiscuity and boundaries. You have to address that issue therapeutically, and it's good because you're setting boundaries for him for perhaps the first time ever. You will have clients that say things to you like this. I love you. They might call you cutie pie or sweetheart. Sometimes you have to set those boundaries so that you don't end up on a slippery slope where they've been blurred so much that now you're in trouble. So here's how I deal with that situation when I get it. I say something to the effect of, you know, I see that you're in this crisis, and we know that you have this history of promiscuity and boundary violating, and what I see you doing is, now that I'm seeing you for this crisis, you're telling me you love me. You're kind of using that L word, that intimacy, kind of going in a sexual direction because you're under stress again. This is all a part of your cycle. So let's examine the cycle and let's break that cycle right now to where you can deal with this crisis without turning to love or intimacy as an issue. And that was a very, very successful intervention. We were able to get a lot of good work done that day, and that cycle was eventually broken because I was able to use that example to call attention to it. And it worked very, very well. So let's review types of boundary issues. We have self-disclosure, and we're going to talk about that here in a second, because self-disclosure is when you tell clients too much about yourself. I have had situations where I've taken over a therapy group, and I've gone in and sat down and we've started talking about their issues, and one of them has brought up the previous therapist's divorce and talked about what a horrible divorce it was and how upsetting and how the ex was causing problems, and I've said, how do you know all that? And they said, well, the therapist told us. Well, why was that? Well, they thought that might help us to understand how to deal with those kinds of issues in relationships. Now that is too much self-disclosure. And at that point, I would have to ask, whose need are you really meeting? Is it the client's, or is it your own need to talk? And as therapists, we do sometimes have a need to talk because we listen all day long. But it's not appropriate to disclose to clients. In fact, sometimes it can be a safety issue. If you're working with folks that tend to be at high risk of inappropriate behaviors, and you let them know that you have family members or children, you know, there may be a safety issue involved. So be careful about self-disclosure. Another big reason to be careful about self-disclosure is clients use it to judge you. What if your client is seeing you for problems with their children, and they ask you if you have children, and you tell them, no, you don't have any children? Anything you say from that point forward in the therapeutic intervention is probably going to be ignored because the person has now judged you and said, I don't think this person knows what they're talking about because they don't have kids. Well, you could still be an effective therapist because you've been trained to be an effective therapist in family therapy and so forth, but you're not going to get the chance to do that because the client's now judged you. Gifts is another type of boundary issue. We've talked about that. Business relationships and friendships, you can't go into business with clients. You can't have friendships with them. Now, Facebook makes that difficult because if your agency has a Facebook page, you have to friend clients. And I don't like that use of terminology. So I would suggest that you make sure that you define your relationship with your clients so they know that you're not really friends. You're using Facebook terminology, but you cannot be friends with clients. You can't bend rules with clients. You can't give clients over here preferential treatment to clients over here. Remember, they talk. You will cause damage. Physical contact. You know, we used to think it was okay to hug sexual abuse victims to show them the importance of healthy touch or appropriate touch. Well, we now know that's not always the best thing to do because we also are violating their space in a way that they've not necessarily approved for us to do. So we have to be careful about physical contact. I shake hands with clients and that's it because that's a socially appropriate form of physical contact. When I see them, when they come to my agency for the first time, I shake their hands and I say, hey, it's very nice to meet you. Thank you for coming in today. And I think that's important to do for respect reasons, but I won't do anything else. And then, of course, sex. We talked about sexual boundaries. So, in review, can you sell a car to a client? No. And you can't tell anyone why either. Okay, how about can you accept gifts from your clients? Well, we've talked about reasons that it's not a good idea to accept gifts from clients. I recognize that some of you are going to do what you think is right and what you're comfortable with, but I recommend a policy of not accepting gifts from clients. One thing that agencies have told me is we have a policy, no gifts under no gifts over $25. That's okay if that's your policy, but it still may make clients feel pressured to do something for you, like make the brownies or whatever, and then also you have to decide what's the value of this. How many boxes of brownie mix went into this? Is it over $25? And I just like a blanket policy of no gifts if you can do that at your agency. Now, what do you do if a gift is anonymous? That's trickier. If a gift is anonymous, my suggestion is that you give it to a charity. If you can't figure out who gave you the gift, give it to a charity. At least that way you're not accepting the gift. Now, let me run another scenario by you. It's a child you're working with and they draw you pictures. Or it's a client that you worked with and they send you a thank you card. Do you return those things? Well, I would suggest to you in those cases, you put that in their file as documentation of their case. And sometimes those pictures and images can be very helpful. They can give you therapeutic information. If a child sends you a picture and no one has a mouth in the entire picture, well, art therapists would tell you that that means something. So that art being in that chart is actually a very important thing. So I would, in those instances, recommend that you go ahead and put those materials in the chart. But certainly don't encourage clients to feel that they need to all send you a card. Let's try another scenario. Can you attend a client's commitment ceremony? Now, this is a client who you helped them come out. They're very comfortable with you. The first person they ever told that they wanted to have a commitment ceremony was you. You've been very supportive of them. Can you attend that ceremony? Some of you are going to want to do that, but if you do that for one, you must be prepared to do it for all. And the problem with that is you're going to spend all your time going to commitment ceremonies, weddings, funerals, etc. How are you going to bill it? Or are you going to bill it? Or is it going to be on your time? What if you get injured on your way to doing this? Is that agency or is that your responsibility? And then who would you say you are? You can't go to this commitment ceremony and say, well, I'm his nieces, uncles, aunts, sisters, babysitters, cousins, dog sitters, brothers, cousin 3 times removed, wife. You can't, who are you going to say you are? So again, think about that. Think about the ramifications of that. Think about the damage if you do that for one client and not for another, and if people find out that you're this person's therapist. Let's review another situation. You haven't seen your client for 5 years. Can you now have a sexual relationship with him or her? Well, in Ohio, the answer is yes, after 5 years, but the burden is on you to prove no harm. But the NASW says, and I say, no, it's not a good idea. Once a client, always a client, because I think there's too much potential for harm to occur. So let's talk about this one. Your client is going through a painful divorce. Coincidentally, so are you. You decide to share your experience with your divorce because it might help your client come to terms with their divorce. Good idea? No, it's a boundary violation. Again, whose need are you meeting? And are you providing the opportunity for a client to judge you? Those are all things that you have to consider. Even if it feels like you're doing it just to help the client with their own situation, you can be just as effective, if not more so, without revealing what's going on in your own life. And I think it's important as clinicians that we do that we get good at using therapeutic technique to help clients without resorting to sharing our own experiences. Now we're going to talk about another topic, transference and countertransference. And for those of you that may not remember from school, transference is feelings expressed or felt by the client towards the therapist. Now this can be a rational reaction to the personality of the therapist. It can be a projection of someone that they remembered from the past or earlier attitudes, stereotypes, memories, etc. Sometimes we aren't even going to know what caused the transference. Now how do you handle it? Well, you accept that it's a common and natural part of the process and you reassure the client about that. Remember, some of these clients have never revealed this information that they're telling you before to anyone. And here you are being the first person to take that information and you're not judging them. That's going to feel really good, and sometimes clients cross that boundary. They feel like that's a little too good and they want to violate boundaries. You have to assure them that, hey, this is normal. It's normal for you to feel this way. This is the first time you're revealing this information, but I'm your counselor. I'm going to help you to cope with that information. But that's it. Build the therapeutic relationship by helping them deal with that reaction. Sometimes just hearing from you that it's normal and natural makes them feel so much better that they're more comfortable even talking to you after that. Help the client learn what triggered the feelings and how to cope with it here and now. Sometimes it's really important to get at the root of why they're having this reaction to you or something that you said. Sometimes that's the whole heart of the therapeutic issue. And so it's important to deal with that issue with them and help them with it. Now, in cases of severe hostility, you remind this client of somebody that they cannot stand and wanted to harm, or they're angry with you about something you said to the point where they're threatening you, you must transfer. Now, again, we've talked about abandonment, so you have to have a good reason to transfer and you have to document that, otherwise you're just abandoning the client. You can't transfer everyone if they express any kind of negative feeling towards you, but in cases of severe hostility, you should try to transfer for your own safety and for the client's help, because they're not going to get help from you if they're feeling such hostility from you. I have had counselors tell me from other agencies that they were forced to continue working with clients who'd been physically threatening to them or had told them, I'm going to hurt you, and I don't think that's appropriate. If a client has that kind of extreme transference reaction to you, you should try to initiate a transfer and document it. Now, what if it's going the other way? And it's countertransference. Now the emotional reaction and projections are yours onto the client. And sometimes you're conscious of that, and sometimes you're actually not conscious of that. For example, if you find that every Monday afternoon you absolutely dread your job, but you realize it's because there's a client you're seeing and you have trouble dealing with their issues, that's countertransference you may not have even been aware of until you put it all together. So we need to examine our process really thoroughly and make sure that we understand why we're having this reaction. So what can you do? Well, first of all, make sure that you're always analyzing your sessions with your clients to see if any of your reactions are coming up or any of your values are coming up as you're working with this client. Accept that you have these feelings. We are not blank slates. We have feelings about the things that we hear. So accept that you're going to have feelings about the things that your clients are saying. Maybe talk to peers at the agency about the issue that you're having with this client and just vent, express, analyze, deal with, get feedback. That's a very, very important process. You can also do that with your supervisor, and it's important to do that. In extreme cases, as I mentioned, transfer the case if you feel like it's too much for you to handle, but you can't do that with everyone. So make sure it's something you genuinely don't feel you can handle, and then document it. And then, any of you that work in agencies, your agency supervisors or are going to be very happy with me right now, because I'm going to suggest that the last option for you in countertransference situations is to take a vacation. So you all get to go take a vacation now. And the reason is because sometimes we get very burnt out when we deal with clients that have all of these issues. And that does cause a countertransference reaction. And I know as social workers, we would never dream of being overworked, right? But we are, and we're overworked all the time. And because of that, it's easier for us to develop those countertransference reactions because we're tired, because we're burnt out, and because we're human beings. It's natural for us to have those reactions. Let me give you some examples. You see a drug and alcohol dependent patient, they killed someone with their car. And you're having a reaction to that because of something they did, and you're not sure what to say to this person in the therapeutic session. That's a difficult situation. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself and talking to peers about that. Maybe your patient's a sex offender who just got out of prison for the rape of an infant. That's a very difficult situation. That's going to provoke some very strong reactions in you as the therapist. And in that situation, again, examine your process, analyze your feelings, understand that's natural. Talk about with peers and supervisors how you're feeling. Recognize why you're doing that kind of work, perhaps. That you're doing this kind of work to prevent these situations from happening going forward. That can help a lot. Now let's talk about what countertransference can lead to if you don't take care of yourself, and it's something called secondary trauma. And this is what I close with because I think it's most important if we're going to be ethical practitioners that we take good care of ourselves. We are great as social workers at taking care of others. We are not always as good at taking care of ourselves, and we need to be better about that, because if we're not, it can create unethical practice because we won't be our best. We won't be 110% with our clients, and it's really important to be at 110% with all of our clients. They all deserve our best. Now, secondary trauma also goes under other names: compassion fatigue, countertransference, which we've talked about, burnout, I call it feeling toasty, and vicarious traumatization. Those are all terms for secondary trauma. How does secondary trauma happen? Because day in, day out, we hear things that clients have done, that clients are telling us they've done, their fantasies, their thoughts, their behaviors, and those have an impact on us. If you're hearing about sexual abuse, severe sexual abuse, for 20 years, from different clients, isn't that going to have impacts on you even though you weren't the one that was sexually abused? Sure it is. Sure it is. Look at some of the situations that we as social workers end up in. Maybe you're dealing with an ER patient who goes into cardiac arrest, or an infant fatality, or a rape victim. Maybe you're dealing with all those at the same time in an ER. That creates trauma for us. That creates burnout. It's hard to do that day in and day out. Maybe you fill out forms with a patient who appears awake and alert, they're fine, they're not in distress. The next day you come in and find out they died during the night. Now you've got to help their family, make arrangements, you've got to get other family members into town, and you've also got to call security to deal with a hysterical, belligerent family member. Those situations are tough for us to deal with day in and day out. And we need, again, to take care of ourselves, because these things have their impacts. What kind of impacts do they have? Well, we may have intrusive imagery about things, and how that happens is you'll be dreaming in the middle of the night about a client and what they're dealing with, and oh my gosh, did I handle that? Or you may be at church, in the middle of church, you're thinking about a client you forgot to call. That's kind of intrusive stuff that tends to happen to us. You may have avoidance symptoms where you suddenly don't feel like going to work. Why does that happen? Well, it happens because you're tired, you're needing a break, you're getting burnt out. You may have a decreased sense of personal safety, or a decreased sense of safety of significant others in your life, or hypervigilance around strangers if you tend to hear about traumatic things that clients have done or experienced. It may impact how you feel about the environment around you and how safe it is. You may have difficulty with trust and intimate relationships. You know, I've known counselors and social workers who have gone through divorces and asking them, wow, what happened? One thing they seem to say over and over again is, I just didn't have anything left. I couldn't go home and listen to people talking to me about their problems in my life because I had done that all day. Or I needed to talk to somebody because I'd been listening all day and there was no one there for me to talk to. They're tired of me talking about my issues at home all the time, but I can't talk about those anywhere else. So it can cause difficulty with intimate relationships. Self-esteem issues. A lot of times counselors run into this when they feel like their intervention failed or they weren't effective with a client. They can tend to feel very bad about themselves or start to question their ability as a practitioner. You can have increased cynicism, you can get depressed, you can increase substance use, feel disruptions in sexuality. All those things can be effects of secondary trauma. So what do we do to take care of ourselves so that we are our best possible clinician, we're our most ethical practitioner, we're giving every client 110%, which is what I feel like they deserve? How do we do that? Well, always do self-assessment and monitoring. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself, and that if you're not, that you find a way to take care of yourself and recognize that you're starting to struggle. Use your supervisor. Talk to your supervisor. Do consultations. That will help. If you're talking to other people about what you're dealing with, those are people that can listen to what's going on with you, and you need to take advantage of that. Continual trainings. I don't know about you, but when I go to a training or listen to a training like this, I get energized. I come up with suggestions, ideas, thoughts that I can use in my own practice and in my own agency I'd like to incorporate in. I don't always get to all of them, but I can tell you that the training energizes me. It makes me feel better about my practice. And so we need those trainings, not just to satisfy some board requirement, but because it energizes our practice and makes us better at what we do. We need social support. Don't just go home every night, be by yourself, not talk, withdraw. We need people. You know, there's a movie, Castaway, where Tom Hanks talked to a volleyball. Why was that? Because we as human beings need social contact. We need people. We need to talk, we need to know people care about us, and we need to care about others. We need that nurturing. So make sure that you're getting that to take care of yourself. We need to understand that secondary trauma is more likely to develop when we're hearing graphic stories dealing with abuse and trauma and those kinds of things. We need to recognize that that's inherent in our job if that's what we're dealing with. And we need to recognize that if we don't deal with secondary trauma, it can interfere with our ability to work with clients. And sometimes we really just need to take a vacation. We do. We need to take care of ourselves. So again, you can tell all your supervisors that I said you need to go take a vacation, and then they can be mad at me, but it's important. It's important that we take those days off and we take care of ourselves. I used to be just like a lot of you may be, and that's I was working 60 hours or more in an agency. I was devoting all this time to it. I was going in on weekends to do paperwork. I was doing all of that. It was killing me. Just like you. Now, I take a vacation and I don't apologize for it. I recharge the batteries, and it's really, really important to do that. Last but not least, I always remember why I do the work that I do. And I work with a lot of people who have perpetrated crimes against kids, and my job is to hold them accountable. Why do I do that? Because I want kids to be able to stay innocent and live their lives as children and have their childhood and be happy kids. I want them to remain innocent as long as they can. So I'm going to leave you with this. This is children's answers on a science test, and this is why I do what I do, and remembering that keeps me from being burnt out. So one child, when asked to name the 4 seasons, said salt, pepper, mustard, and vinegar. Another child was asked to explain the process by which water is made safe to drink. Well, this child said flirtation makes water safe to drink because it removes large pollutants like grit, sand, dead sheep, and canoeists. I think that's great. So the reason there are no dead sheep or canoeists in your water is because of flirtation. What are steroids? Thanks for keeping carpets still on the stairs. And how do you delay milk turning sour? Well, duh, you keep it in the cow. So thank you very much for listening. Take care of yourselves and be the best ethical practitioner that you can be.